And thank you so much for that introduction and thank you for your leadership and thank you for this invitation to address the graduates of the LBJ School of Public Affairs at UT Austin. It's truly an honor. And I just want to, of course, thank the faculty and thank the staff. I want to thank, of course, the families and the parents and the friends, but most of all, I want to thank the graduates. I am really excited to see across the world, but especially in the United States and especially at the LBJ School, to see what these graduates, to see what you do. And certainly you couldn't have more adversity than you've had in the last year, but what I know about human beings who go through adversity, it builds a sense of resilience. It creates a sense of determination, and it also creates a sense of boldness. And so I'm just excited to sit back and see what it is you do and how you transform this world. I also want to share a special thanks to Professor Peniel Joseph. I don't think I've ever told Professor Joseph this, but when I was a graduate student getting my PhD at Temple University, where he also received his graduate degree, I read his book, Waiting to the Midnight Hour, in one of my classes. And at the time, I was really trying to figure out how to write like an academic. I was trying to learn the jargon, apply the format. And in many ways, I was not also thinking about how to write for regular everyday people. I wasn't also thinking about how to write books that were deeply scholarly and researched, that also could be read and understood by everyone, including academics. And so in many ways, this book, Waiting to the Midnight Hour, stopped me in my tracks. Not only was it just an incredible study of Black power, but the way it was written and the beauty of its writing really allowed me to see what an academic is capable of. And so in many ways, it set me on a course to think that maybe I could write similar books that were deeply researched and deeply scholarly. And so I want to thank Professor Joseph for that. I also, it sort of really goes to show the role of professors at the LBJ School, the role that they play by their teaching, by their research, and by their mentorship. And so I'm so glad each of you graduates have Professor Joseph and his colleagues to be able to shape you in the way he has shaped me. So I want to speak for a few moments during this address from the title, Equity as a Result. Equity as a Result. President Lyndon B. Johnson on June 4th, 1965, gave a commencement address. And that commencement address was in Washington, D.C. at Howard University, one of the most historically Black universities in the country. And in this speech, 56 years ago, President Johnson spoke about how he said racial progress has primarily come from a growing middle-class minority, and talked about how while for poor Blacks, quote, the walls are rising and the gulf is widening. And this, of course, was despite many of the Supreme Court rulings, despite the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He stated that 35 years ago, the rate of unemployment for Negroes and whites was about the same. Tonight, he said, the Negro rate is twice as high. And then he went on to talk about how in recent decades, income disparities between the racial groups had grown. Disparities in poverty rates had grown. Disparities in infant mortality had grown. Urban segregation had grown. And ultimately in this speech, President Johnson, said to the Howard University graduates that you do not wipe away the scars of centuries by saying, now you are free to go where you want and do as you desire and choose the leaders you please. He said, you do not take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him. Bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say, you are free to compete with all others and still justly believe that you have been completely fair. He said, thus, it is not enough to just open the gates of opportunity. All our citizens must have the ability to walk through those gates. This, President Johnson said in 1965, is the next and more profound stage of the battle for civil rights. We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact, he said, and equality as a result. And so again, he gave this speech, President Johnson did, graduates, in 1965. And what happened? 10 years later, especially by the late 1960s, we as a nation had certainly not achieved equality as a fact. If anything, especially as it related to policies, a new way of sort of thinking about policies created this new dialectic or this new terms that became latched onto different types of policies. And I'm talking about this creation of this idea of a race-conscious policy and a race-neutral policy. And these terms, this framework was largely created by those who were in opposition to equality as a fact. More specifically, those who were in opposition to affirmative action programs, which had been proven to create more equity and inequality. And so instead, those opponents of affirmative action made the case that affirmative action was a race-conscious policy, while other admissions factors or other factors in policies that determine, for instance, who got contracts or who got jobs were, quote, race neutral. And the way that these terms were set up was the outcome, the result was irrelevant. For these thinkers, for these jurists, for these policymakers, they argued a race-conscious policy was a policy that had racial language in them, and a policy more or less that did not have any racial language in them were, quote, race neutral. And then they argued that a race-conscious policy with racial language in it is discriminatory and thereby racist, if not reverse racist or reverse form of reverse discrimination. And race-neutral policies, they argued, with no racial language in them, were actually the American ideal. Even though 60 years prior, Black people in nearly every Southern state had been almost completely disenfranchised by policies, by laws, with no racial language in them. Literacy tests, grandfather clauses, poll taxes, you name the voting policy, they had no racial language in them. But what was the result of literacy tests, of poll taxes, of grandfather clauses? The result was inequality. The result was disenfranchisement. And so what happened thereby, specifically as a result of this new sort of framework of race conscious versus race neutral, we stopped thinking about equality as a fact. We stopped thinking about equality as a result, as President Johnson urged us to do in 1965. And so therefore, we created a nation with policies that reinforced and maintained racial inequities and injustices, and then turned around and imagined that those policies were, quote, not racist, and our nation was not racist. And therefore, and I think that's still the nation, that we're living in. And so I wanted to talk to you today, graduates, about thinking about a different formulation. And I think this is not just relevant to race and racism. I think this is relevant to policy making and thinking about policies in general. In other words, what is the outcome of the policy? Is it bringing people relief? Is it bringing justice? Is it creating equity? I think we, as those of us who think very deeply about policies, have to consistently think about the outcome of the policy. But too often, what happens among those who are policy experts, when the result of a policy is not as was intended to be by the policymaker, instead of the policymaker going back to the drawing board and saying, what was wrong with this policy? Instead, the people are blamed. And indeed, the existence of racial inequities and disparities, we live in a nation today where so many people who are skilled and knowledgeable about policy, just as the general public, are thinking that the cause of those inequities are not the actual policies themselves, that the cause of those inequities are actually what's wrong with a particular racial group. And so in the case of COVID-19, when we found out last April that Black, Brown, and Indigenous people were being infected and killed at the highest rates from COVID-19, we as a nation did not automatically assume, okay, you know what? Is that the result of conditions? And are those conditions the result of policies? No. The American people and even many policymakers stated, well, it must be because there's something wrong with those people. It must be that those people of color are not socially distancing. It must be that they're not taking the coronavirus seriously. There must be something wrong with them because it can't be something wrong with the policies. And so, of course, it turned out when people started actually studying the matter, in particular, when people found that actually Black people were dying at the highest rates from COVID-19, not because there's something wrong with them, not because they're not socially distancing, not because they're not taking the coronavirus seriously, and not even because they have they're more likely to have pre-existing conditions. One study found that indeed what was even a greater factor than pre-existing conditions was the fact that Black people, even middle-income Black people, are more likely to live in polluted neighborhoods with elevated levels of air and water pollution, which then led to pre-existing conditions. That Black people died or dying at higher rates because they're more likely to be essential workers, which of course is another reason why Latinx people are being infected at higher rates, because they're also more likely than white Americans to be essential workers. And what policies have shaped a nation where Black and Brown people and Native people are overrepresented, and Asian Americans are overrepresented in essential worker positions, particularly those service-oriented positions? What are the series of educational policies, of economic policies, of hiring policies that led to that discrepancy, that even leads to Black people being twice as likely to be unemployed than white people, that women of color have been the most likely to lose their jobs during the COVID-19 crisis? What is it about our policies? What is it about our structure? And also that, a study found that another reason why Black people have died at higher rates from COVID-19 has been because they're more likely to live in what's called trauma deserts. And they're also more likely to not have health insurance, which then leads to Black people being more likely to present with advanced stages of COVID And they're more likely to go to hospitals that are not trauma one centers, that do not provide the best high quality life-saving care. And so I think everybody can figure out, what would happen, as a result. What are the policies that led to so many Black people living in trauma deserts where they're not close to trauma one centers? What are the policies that were refusing to pass that caused Black people to be more likely to not have health insurance? But again, the American people and even many, policy makers and policy experts consistently blame people, particularly people who are on the lower end of disparities, for the cause of those disparities. And to me, graduates, that's not a coincidence. And indeed, and what I mean by that is, let me just say first, another reason why I'm excited to be giving this commencement address is because I'm actually quite jealous. If I knew what I knew now, I would have potentially pursued, I potentially would have went to graduate school, at a public policy or public affairs school like LBJ. And the reason why I say that, obviously I can't rewind time, and maybe I can get a second degree, but the reason why I say that is because when I started researching for Stamped from the Beginning, which was this narrative history of anti-Black racist ideas, I assumed that I was going to find research that reinforced the general sort of narrative about the relationship between hate and ignorance, ideas and policies. In other words, we've been taught this perspective historically and currently as it relates to race and even generally, that you have ignorant and hateful people, and it's those ignorant and hateful people, their ignorance and hate causes them to produce racist ideas. Let's say that Black people are lazy or violent or dangerous. And it's perceived that the production of those ideas come out of the ignorance and hate of the producers. And then what's key, particularly for you, we've been taught this theory that people produce racist policies due to their racist ideas. And then it then causes people to say, okay, you know what we need to do is educate the policymakers so they can realize the way in which their policies are racist, the ways in which the ideas that are sort of generating those policies are racist. Now, without question, that happens. But what I found was the dominant pulse over the course of history was something actually the other way around. In other words, what I found through my research, when I distinguished between the producers of racist ideas and the consumers of racist ideas, and I recognized the political connection between the producers of racist ideas and the producers of racist policies, what I found was indeed that people were producing racist policies out of self-interest. And then they were producing racist ideas to justify those policies. And then people were consuming those racist ideas, believing that Black people are dangerous or lazy, and then becoming ignorant and hateful. And so what I found through my research and Stamped from the Beginning was that actually at the core of the racial struggle, and really at the core of the struggle over or for America, is a policy struggle. And when you're talking about a policy struggle, you're talking about power struggle. And I didn't realize that, but before I embarked on the research for Stamped from the Beginning. And so what I've been trying to encourage the American people to think about, and certainly, I don't have to tell you the importance of policies determining the course, of this nation. And I'm mentioning this because, especially as it relates to race and racism, but even as it relates to the nation more broadly, it's critically important that you as graduates realize just how important and vital the work that you are going to do in your career is to shaping the lives of communities. Now, it's without question when it comes to individuals. If an individual would only work harder, if an individual was only a little bit more knowledgeable, then certainly that individual could get ahead more. But when it comes to communities, when it comes to groups, what is determinant, what is critical, what is essential, that is going to essentially dictate the course of the life of a group or a community is policies. And so when we're thinking about communities, we should be thinking about policy change. And when we're thinking about creating an anti-racist nation, we should be thinking about creating and instituting anti-racist policies. I opened talking about the creation of this framework between race neutral and race conscious policies, graduates, and I wanted to offer you a different formulation, a different way to think about policies as it relates to race. And that formulation is racist and anti-racist policies. And all policies either are maintaining or growing racial inequity, or they're reducing or eliminating racial inequity. And a policy that is maintaining or growing racial inequity is by definition a racist policy, whether it has racial language in it or not, whether the policymaker intended to maintain or reduce, or I should say grow an inequity or not. Just as an anti-racist policy is any measure that leads to equity, that reduces inequity, or creates justice for all people. Whether the policymaker intended to create justice and equity or not, we need to begin to realize that when it comes to defining terms, particularly defining policies, that the outcome is critical. Equality as a result, as President Johnson said, equality is a fact, as President Johnson says. But I also want to push us to think about the distinction between equality and equity. And I think that's why, even though President Johnson said equality is a fact, I want us to think about equity as a fact. But in order for us to think about equity as a fact, I want to discuss the difference between equality and equity. You know, when it comes to human value, particularly the value between different groups, we need equality. Equality is valuing all phenotypes, skin colors, ethnic groups, cultural groups equally, despite their differences, placing them all on the same level. Because indeed, to create a world where every human group is valued equally is to create a world where every human is valued equally. But when it comes to policy, we need equity, not equality. Policy equality is providing the same, meaning the outcome of the policies is essentially providing the same to unequally resourced groups. Policy equity is allocating resources based on the policy to unequally resourced groups based on need. You know, as an example, providing middle-income people with the same resources due to a policy as billionaires prolongs the inequality in resources. But providing middle-income people with more resources than billionaires reduces the inequity in resources. Policy equality only replicates and amplifies the inequality that is there from the start, while policy equity, on the other hand, repairs the inequity. And so in a general sense, graduates, I just want to leave you with this thought inspired by President Johnson's speech in 1965, his commencement speech to Howard University graduates, the thought of equity as a fact. How do we create equity as a fact? How do we envision, create, innovate, and institute policies that can create equity as a fact? How can we as a nation begin to think about ways to provide the most resources for the groups that have the greatest needs? That is the way in which we consider policy equity. And that's not just by race. You know, there are people based on their class, based on their ability, based on their gender, based on their sexual orientation, based on their ethnicity, based on their religion, who need more based on policies. And so I want us to be thinking about, how do we provide more resources for those who need them the most? That's how we create an equitable nation. And that wouldn't be just an equitable nation and world, that would be a just nation. That would be a nation that provides equity as a fact, as President Johnson implored us to do in 1965. Thank you.